Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and it is for Friday, and it is that time again when we cover everything that has happened this week in Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics. Welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 58. For those new to the show, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 2 decades of my life on studying Bitcoin, investing, money, and trying to prepare people for a world dominated by Bitcoin AI and CBDCs. Started as a banking reformer, moved over to Bitcoin, and now doing everything I can to try and help people follow the money in both Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics so that we can be on the right side of history. So this week we had the IMF completely freaking out over El Salvador's Bitcoin policy all again. We had China stocks pumping like crazy based upon the PBOC stimulus, and we had Iran retaliating to Israel's escalation. And we're going to jump through exactly what that means and how we need to build and protect our wealth as we transition on into this crazy, chaotic world that our central banks are taking us to. Now, firstly, I'd like to give a little bit of people misunderstand my message often. They think when I'm saying things about America going to war on 3 fronts, they think I'm referring to like the everyday American people. I'm not referring to the people. I'm referring to the structure that I've always been sharing on Bitcoin Hard Talk, that it's not really our governments in charge and they're not really democracies. At the very top of all of our economies is a central bank. And that central bank has a very, very, very dark history. And we're meant to believe that over time, that dark history suddenly became a good player actor that was out for our interest to try and help our economies by centralizing them, by getting our governments deep into debt, by removing any eminence of a gold standard to try and reduce that debt by governments, and by executing secret operations through intelligence agencies like the CIA in order to control the government and take them into war, which is all we have seen since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. And it is all we saw when the Bank of England was created prior to that. And it is all we shall see until we drain the swamp from these central banks and recognize what is actually happening, because they are covertly taking our economies from sound free market capitalist economies with constitutional or Magna Carta rights and turning them into debt-based Ponzi schemes on a fiat currency proof of weapons network that creates death and destruction all around the world in the pretense that we are exporting democracy. So I'm not talking about the American people. In fact, I believe that I am more patriotic to America and Britain and to all of our countries, because I believe the foundation of patriotism is to create a good working environment and monetary system for all the people and companies for capitalism to prevail in a real free market and decentralized control and make government smaller. And most importantly, call out the system when the system is corrupt. So I just want to make that clarity, and that refers to all of the different countries that I refer to, before people get patriotic and think that patriotism is blindly accepting that what your government is doing is okay. Right, with that in mind, let's jump straight into the Bitcoin section. So we've been covering over the last few years how TradFi, traditional finance, the banks and financial institutions, firstly, they laughed at us when we presented Bitcoin to them. I remember it was 2014 when I was asked to go around and present Bitcoin to pretty much all the money managers around the world. I gave in 2013 the UK a Bitcoin strategy, presented it to ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I gave a Bitcoin strategy to the Isle of Man to make it legal tender, and the Bank of England contacted the Isle of Man government and said, "We are in control. You are merely a government. You must follow the Bank of England. And if you support this Bitcoin strategy, we're going to remove clearing and we're going to create a financial apartheid and fire a financial weapon of mass destruction across the island." But eventually, President Bukele in 2021, and I flew over, even though we were in lockdowns, I had to get a couple of private jets just to make sure that I gave my perspective to Bukele once the community made Bitcoin legal tender of how to fight the treachery of the economic hitmen at the IMF that are spreading the debt-based Ponzi scheme of the dollar all around the world to the death, destruction, and misery of any country that dares take the blood money of the International Monetary Fund. That always leads to civil wars, revolutions, covert regime changes, and all the stories that John Perkins very kindly recognized and documented for us in his brilliant book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. If you want to hear it from the people involved in those economic hitmen covert operations themselves. And by the way, none of this goes through congressional approval. None of this goes through parliament. These are hidden secret operations designed to deceive us and funded by the central banks that benefit for their shareholders. The shareholders being the banks and financial institutions that they're meant to be regulating, but are the designers of the system that ended up getting our governments deep into debt in order to fight both sides of the wars that they can fund. We will dig deeper as we progress. Well, anyway, the TradFi financial institutions that laughed at us when I first told them about Bitcoin, they eventually wanted to take out Bitcoin by creating their own blockchains. When everyone realized their blockchains were things that no one wanted because they were centralized pieces of crap, they eventually capitulated and decided to take down all the traditional players in our industry by creating a pump and dump at the Federal Reserve. They called it inflation is transitory. And then they hiked rates. They allowed the regulators, allowed our industry to have scammers like Majinsky and SBF make our industry look bad. They wiped them out. Billions was lost. And then they executed Operation Choke Point 2.0, where they took out all the banks that were servicing our industry. And then they approved BlackRock and Bank of New York Mellon and all the traditional financial players to come along and say, hey, guess what? Bitcoin does change the world right at the point when they've got our government deep into debt and we are on the verge of World War III, so they can start protecting themselves and plan for whatever they believe is the next new world order. But anyway, TradFi, they are still continuing their attempted takeover. And remember, because Bitcoin has proof of work, you just need to hold it in self-custody and not hold it in an ETF or in custody with a traditional financial institution if you want to boycott and resist. We have a lot more Bitcoin in self-custody, but traditional finance are trying to get you to own it through the stock market, and regulations are being set to facilitate that. And so in order to resist the takeover, and by the way, it doesn't matter who owns Bitcoin, because fortunately, we kept it decentralized by keeping the block small so that nodes could run no matter what and who owns it, and miners could mine no matter what. And that was geographically diversified. And we didn't bow down to the ESG narrative of BlackRock saying that we need to transition to proof of stake to be environmentally friendly. Instead, we change the energy markets and we encourage countries that want to have bleeding edge innovation in the energy markets by utilizing the power of Bitcoin and backing and resisting the atrocities of the central banks and all the wars that they enable by creating a peaceful resistance movement called Bitcoin. Well, the takeover continues. The $1.6 trillion Franklin Templeton money manager, they filed for their Bitcoin and ETH index ETF with the SEC. No doubt they will be approved. And Bank of New York Mellon got approved while SEC is suing Coinbase, one of the traditional players in our industry, in order to make sure that all the custody goes over to the banks and the shareholders of the Federal Reserve System. At the same time, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, they're putting forward an initiative to allow tokenized shares as collateral so that people can take their assets they can tokenize them through the Ethereum network, which will be predominantly controlled eventually through an Ethereum ETF that will be a proof of stake mechanism, which means whoever owns the stake controls the governance of the network. And then they will launch their stable coins and they will launch their tokenized securities on top of it, where they have control over the governance of the network. And then they will borrow against it through stable coins, which is cool because stable coins are actually a resistance against the very same banks. But they want to wipe out all the small banks by the Federal Reserve's pump and dump schemes, which leads to all of the smaller banks going bankrupt, being gobbled up by the larger banks until eventually JP Morgan and the designers of the Federal Reserve System own all of the banks because they control all the policy and they are too big to fail. And then when they go bust, you can just wipe it out for a central bank digital currency. And the original mission of the Federal Reserve has been achieved. The government's deep in debt. You restructure that debt into a central bank digital currency, and you take a beautiful constitutional capitalist country like America and turn it into communism on a blockchain. And you can see the strategy rolling out, but we won't fall for it because you are watching Bitcoin Hard Talk every single week. But I have to admit, there are companies that I have invested in that are being apart because they can't see through it. I invested in a company called Securitize. Securitize created the Beetle Treasury Fund, which is tokenizing these treasuries. And this is competition because stable coins and tokenized treasuries create competition in the fractional reserve banking system. That is a good thing. We can deleverage, but there's going to be some major changes along the way. It will make the system more centralized because it will wipe out a lot of the banks, and they'll all be created on the proof of stake system rather than the proof of work system. And maybe eventually they can compete with assets that exist on decentralized Bitcoin proof of work. We shall see. But it doesn't really matter as long as we have our Bitcoin in self-custody to resist in that two-tiered system. But anyway, these assets are already being tokenized on top of Securitize, and they are tradable. And now they could be used through by collateral through a prime brokerage called FalconX. And obviously, FalconX is just a beta tester until BlackRock launches their own stock exchange in Texas that they're applying for right now. And the CFTC, of course, is only supporting the regulations when we've been trying to do this ever since 2013. And they wouldn't let us do this until their buddies were in the industry. And now all of a sudden, the regulators care, even though they could have stopped all those scams that happened by not regulating the centralized companies. Remember, Bitcoin doesn't need regulation. If they could have taken us down, they tried to take us down. But the proof of work, decentralized supercomputer, the largest, most secure computer in the world, protected us from all of the takeover attempts. But you shall choose. And don't worry, Bitcoin self-custody will always exist because there are satellites that will even allow Bitcoin to work even if the internet gets taken down. And we can adjust, and everything has been factored into this truly life-changing concept. But at the same time, the fraudsters like SBF that were implanted into our industry that were funding and using client funds in order to fund both the Republican and Democrat Party to make sure that SBF is the only person that can meet Gary Gensler at the SEC, even though he was running a multi-billion-dollar fraud. Well, as a result of that bankruptcy, he ends up in prison. And now those that are left over, while the SEC says, we'll approve you, these ones we're going to chuck in bankruptcy, the creditors and the victims of the fund get gaslighted because what happens to the upside of their assets that they left in the fraudulent bank FTX? Well, the plan has been approved, and they are being told that they're getting 118% of their money back. But that 100% is based upon not the price of Bitcoin today, which is about 60,000, but based upon the price of Bitcoin after the Federal Reserve created the pump and dump that took out Silicon Valley Bank and all the others, that then led to the deleveraging of the fraudsters like Celsius and FTX, that then crashed the market down to $16,000 per Bitcoin, persuading people that didn't understand that Bitcoin's where you want to be and you want to be buying into the dip. And so they ended up selling it, and they locked in the price at the bankruptcy of $16,000 per Bitcoin. And then they say, based upon a price of $16,000 per Bitcoin, we're going to give you a dollarized claim. And we're going to give you, because the price of Bitcoin went up, we're going to keep the upside in the estate and all the other assets that went up with it. We'll auction those all off for our buddies, and we'll just pretend to you that you're getting 100% of the plan back. Now, what happened after everybody got to vote on this plan? They suddenly put in a clause after, or a disclosure, let's call it, after the plan was voted for. And they said that after the 100% made whole, all of the other assets are going to go to the preferred shareholders. And those shareholders were the very same people that had all the inside information that the customers didn't have. And people like Kevin O'Leary that took $15 million for a sponsorship deal of client money to tell the world how FTX is the real player and Binance is not the real player, even though Binance didn't lose any client money. And now, there's nobody has lost their client money in Binance, but everyone lost all the upside of their Bitcoin in FTX. And Kevin O'Leary tells everybody how Binance is a scam and FTX is the real deal because they use client money in order to bribe the SEC to get the regulations and the political influence. And then the judge says, we don't need to look into any of that. We don't need to look into any of the money that was coming through Ukraine, going into cryptocurrencies from America funding Ukraine and siphoning it off into the pockets of the corrupt politicians in Ukraine. Don't need to look into any of that. We'll just focus on SBF. We'll throw him in prison because he is a scammer and a criminal after all. But we don't look into the real systemic problems. Those get swept under the door. And the victims, they get a dollarized claim back. We get to make them look like they're whole. And then the upside goes to the shareholders, which were complicit in the perpetration of the crime, which is Sequoia Capital, the infamous VC that has a lot of lobby money that will be lobbying all the politicians in order to control the politics of America and bribe the system into its submission. This is what we call democracy, people. And the victims, they just get their dollar value back. You will have your dollar check and be happy while we give the upside to Kevin O'Leary and Sequoia Capital. And so the court hearing to approve this will be on October the 7th. Now they suddenly just wipe that in after the plan is approved. And guess what? Everybody just wants their dollars back so they can buy the Bitcoin back again because they want to get into Bitcoin as fast as possible. And suddenly, as a result of the plan being approved, the Ponzi scheme that was committing all the fraud when SBF prints his own shitcoin, just like fiat currency called the FTT token, that allowed it to hold an asset on its balance sheet and pretend they were solvent, despite the fact that you couldn't sell these tokens because nobody wanted it. And as soon as Binance pointed out, or CZ said, we're selling our tokens, it crashed the whole system, just like Cell token and the Celsius Ponzi scheme. The FTT token suddenly surges because idiots are speculating on that. Why? Because they are idiots and they think that this is all about increasing your fiat currency dollar wealth so that they can end up with a plan of putting or owning some Bitcoin in their good little BlackRock ETF held in custody with Bank of New York Mellon, so that while the proof of weapons network goes into war and martial law happens, your ETFs can probably be confiscated and all the people that held it in self-custody have the real value. Please learn how to hold your Bitcoin in self-custody, own your own money, spend your own money, and do what Satoshi Nakamoto invented for us in the first place, which is the ability to escape the fraudsters at the central banks, not enhance the profits of the very same financial institutions that are looking to create collateralized, tokenized loans, and bamboozle you into making sure you own your Bitcoin with them. Look, if that's your way to get started, no problem, but make sure you get started on the other side as well. This bankruptcy was theft of the upside of people's Bitcoin and a transference of wealth to the perpetrators of the crime, the shareholders that had the inside information, like Sequoia Capital and Kevin O'Leary, that was being used in order to legitimize a false sense of hope of why people should be using the FTX exchange anyway. And that is how the US bankruptcy system works. And it was enabled and papered over by using client money in order to bribe Republican and Democrat systems in the lobby group and use Gary Gensler from the SEC in order to create a rig game where they're picking the winners and losers based upon political reasons because they work for the Federal Reserve, not Congress. Congress would be a democracy. The Federal Reserve works in secret societies and assassinates anyone that doesn't play with their game or bribes them through network like Epstein or P. Diddy in order to have leverage over them to get what they really want. I hope you're understanding the picture that changes when you follow the money and you don't listen to the people bamboozled by the traditional media network that tries to make you think that something else is happening here. Well, remember, this was disclosed after voting, which is the same thing that happened in Celsius because I was fighting for creditors in that whole thing. And now the perpetrator of the crime, Maszynski, as we covered last week, is saying it all points back to Israel. And there are 6 people that need to be held trial, but instead of being held for trial and facing their crimes, they're actually creating new AI startups with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel, and some of the coins that were hacked from that, like Bancor DAO, were actually companies and shell companies where the niece and nephew of Netanyahu, the president of Israel, or prime minister, whatever it is, was actually the shareholder in those companies. So we all start to realize that many of these networks point back to the same types of shadows and secrecy, which is causing so much carnage in our political system. And as we cover the geopolitical side, we'll make sure you understand the 3 American war machines that are benefiting from all the escalations of wars, while the traditional media machine covers it up and makes you think that the very same opposite of what is happening here. So as I said, Kevin O'Leary and Sequoia Capital, 2 names to add to the list of our Bitcoin Hard Talk beneficiaries of those that lost the upside of their Bitcoin. But hopefully you learned the message. At the same time, what happened to SBF? Well, he is now joined by Sean P. Diddy Coombs, who has now got the same lawyer representing Maszynski, SBF, and P. Diddy. And we will see if Maszynski in January 2025, after the court hearing, ends up in the same place that it looks like SBF and P. Diddy are going to end up. And of course, if there is too much to be revealed, just like it was for Epstein, we don't expect too many people to survive for that. Depends on how they gain power in the bribery network. But SBF has now been joined in the same prison with the same lawyer as P. Diddy. We will continue to follow the money. At the same time, remember how I covered the story around how Steve Wilkoff, maybe I got that. I need to go back to the Twitter. I'm infamously bad with names anyway. He was golfing with President Trump when the second assassination attempt happened. And on Monday, he announced that Steve Wilkoff, who was deeply connected to the Mossad operation, Urban Movers, which was connected to the bribery network that knew about 9/11 before the false flag operation and controlled demolition. Well, he is now the shareholder in World Liberty Financial, and I covered that in previous broadcasts. And he was actually on the X space with Trump's children as well. And World Liberty Financial has now launched their KYC for 2 accredited investors that want to buy and purchase the tokens. We will keep watching this, that it will be associated with this so-called system that seems to have through shareholders a backdoor to Israel as well. We shall see. I'll keep tracking and following the money as well. But they made an announcement on X that thousands have signed up. And remember, also at the same time as him becoming the lead investor, Trump has also taken a lot of lobby money from Israel in order to annex the West Bank and hand it over to Israel, while there is a massive bombardment and and massacre campaign happening in the West Bank, which has nothing to do with the wars, but we're told that none of this is connected. And I'll cover more about the third attempted narrative on President Trump's life as well. We'll be covering that in the geopolitical section. But it was listed on the social media that you can now purchase those tokens. Don't take this as an endorsement. Bitcoin is the real change. Crypto, you may take a small percentage of your Bitcoin and play around with crypto. I just, I manage that in a very different way. If any of you are going to be joining me on the Bitcoin Wealth Builder program next year, this is something I do every 4 years where I share exactly how I invest. Make sure you have a free login to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal on simondixon.com. And I'll be sharing, exactly how I manage this so that I don't need to mess around with all these different pump and dump schemes that come along in our industry that tend to distract. And so the so-called looking out for client interest, SEC, they have now filed a notice of appeal through Ripple XRP case. Full disclosure, very, very early on, I invested in Ripple Labs, the company. I'm not a fan of that project. I don't own any XRP tokens, but the founders of Ripple are using the lobby group in order to try and support a crypto strategy with Kamala Harris. And so they seem to be on that side. And I have not seen anything good coming from the Democratic side in terms of their support for crypto. And the fact that Ripple is one of the main lobby groups supporting the crypto side in the Democrat Party, you can see that that is a network for trying to get banks to use the blockchain and bamboozle people into thinking that they need the XRP token to do it, when really the Ripple Labs, the company, most of their profits is made from selling XRP tokens for people that think the XRP token is needed in their technology. And we are already having massive amounts of announcement from Swift, which was meant to be the main use case here, that are saying that they're moving over to distributed ledger technology or building on a blockchain, while at the same time, BRICS in October this month now will be announcing their payment system. And as soon as we get those details, I think some initial details have been announced, and I'll make sure I dig into that as well. But the point is that the SEC is trying to make sure that tokens are securities, which creates a two-tiered market where the rest of the world is putting virtual asset service provider regimes where people can invest in these things. Not an endorsement to do that, but I prefer the market to figure out things rather than regulators to pick winners and losers, which was never their goal, wasn't meant to be their goal in the first place. It was meant to be disclosure. Anyway, and so this would create a two-tier market where everything's a security within the US, which will drive everyone to Bitcoin and Ethereum, which have been classified as commodities, so that they can get them through the ETFs. But you won't fall for that, of course, because you'll fight for the right to self-custody, because the Constitution says that property rights and freedom of speech are an expression to protect you from government. So I hope that you fight for that. But the rest of the world is allowing it to happen anyway. And America and Trump are saying, we know that if we don't do it here, then competition will. But it looks like the Democrat Party are pushing the crypto side, and then Bitcoin and crypto on the Republican side with the right to self-custody as well. I'll keep adjusting if anything I see changes that. Bitwise, one of the creators of the ETFs, they decided to, just before the announcement that the SEC was countering, they announced that their XRP ETF has been approved. Expect this to be some kind of structure that ends up with the right people in the Democrat being bribed by the lobby, with the traditional financial institutions deciding who the winners and losers are, and then them deciding whether Swift wins or XRP wins. And we will keep continuing to watch this. but I don't expect much from XRP because it's not actually needed. Then we have announcements from the stablecoin that's launched by PayPal. If you have watched previous episodes, you know that I talk about stablecoin as a competition because it is full reserve banking. They are backed by treasuries held by the government, whereas banks, traditional banks, they only have a tiny percentage of reserves there, and the Federal Reserve pump and dump them in order to kill them and destroy them when they want to put them into and consolidate banking and make it more centralized. Well, the stablecoin side is picking up as well. Just in summary, I was talking about PYUSD is being used by PayPal to settle invoices with Ernst & Young. And so they are starting to build their own stablecoin network there to demonstrate how that's going to be working. At the same time, USDT has until the end of the year to comply with European regulations. And so Coinbase made an announcement, but remember, I'm a shareholder in Coinbase, shareholder in Bitfinex, which is the sister company to USDT Tether. I'm a shareholder in Circle, which is the issuer of the USDC stablecoin, full disclosure. When I was supporting the industry, invested in all these companies. But the Coinbase, which mainly uses the USDC stablecoin, announced that they'll stop supporting USDT because it's not compliant with European regulations. And of course, USDC has got through France their license and agreement through their subsidiary in, where is it? Ireland, Dublin, I believe. So that is, again, another example how regulations is used in order to shift the flow of money. And so Coinbase will stop using that at the same time. We got announcements from, let me make sure I get the name right, Senator Neeraj Antani. Sorry if I got that wrong. He introduced a bill to show, to allow the state and local taxes to be paid in Bitcoin and crypto. Please do not make the mistake of paying your taxes in Bitcoin and crypto. But I like the thought of them doing that because essentially you create taxable events when you need to do it. And spending it anyway probably creates a taxable event. But try and pay your taxes with shitty fiat currency that goes down in value rather than Bitcoin, which is designed to go up over the 4-year cycle in value because of its stock to flow ratio is fixed demand and supply as well, or fixed supply relative to the increasing demand, as it were. Not financial advice, but Gresham's law states that people like to spend rubbish money over money they believe to go up in value. And then a few final stories before we jump into the macro side. There is a brilliant marketing strategy by HBO in order to push a new documentary that is making an audacious claim, and many of the claims that we've seen already over the years, that they have figured out who Satoshi Nakamoto is, and all of us, like idiots, are sharing that, and Polymarkets is making markets where we're all speculating on who they are going to announce is the creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, and it's getting brilliant marketing as a result. And I'm sure they're going to tell us something that's not new. My money is on the old conspiracy theory that because Bitcoin's technology, SHA-256, which is an open source cryptography library for private key, public key technology, and the code is all open source, they're returning to the old conspiracy theory that it was created by the CIA because the technology behind it was created by the CIA. And you'll see all the old conspiracy theories reemerge again. And if anyone wants to go through all of those, while they are fun, it doesn't matter because Satoshi left the project. He left the project after the GitHub code was handed over to Gavin Andresen. And then there's a distributed network of getting changes that relies upon consensus from miners and node operators and consumers, which is fully decentralized, even if there is a layer of centralization. And all those code changes are based upon Bitcoin improvement protocols, which is fully available to anybody that wants to follow them as a geek like me on GitHub, that it doesn't matter who Satoshi Nakamoto is. Now, people are speculating that if the government does own the 1 million Bitcoin that were mined in the beginning, then this would be a brilliant way for America to use the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset strategy that Cynthia Lunis has a bill for. And you could even use it in order to fight the system by using the bill that, what's his name, Thomas Massie has right now on ending the Fed, based upon the Bitcoin standard book that he read from Saifedean Ammous. And you can use that in order to restructure the economy in the future to end the Fed. So my hopes are with you, America, that you might be able to free yourself from where the Fed is trying to take you into a communist country. And they are succeeding at that as well. But hopefully you'll be able to resist that. And if it turns out that America owns these 1 million Bitcoin, which I believe they won't, but just indulging in that conspiracy theory, Bitcoin is anti-fragile. And what actually happened anyway is the GitHub repo was handed over to Gavin Andresen. Gavin Andresen told Satoshi Nakamoto that he has a meeting with the CIA to help them understand Bitcoin. And that's when Satoshi Nakamoto left the project. And then we had all of the open source contributors to the Bitcoin code, and the whole rules were enabled because no one controls the code of Bitcoin and the whole thing is open source. But then people started to decrypt the name Satoshi Nakamoto, connect it with intelligence agencies. And recently, Tucker Carlson said that it has been created by the CIA. So re-emerge all of those old conspiracy theories, but they're fun. Come join me, follow me on X. And if you ever want to ask and debate any of these things, we can do that on any of the X spaces. Follow me on X, and we can debate those anyway. But anyway, we're going to find out who the documentary believes is Satoshi Nakamoto. At the same time this week, we got a demonstration of the importance of the distributed supercomputer that is Bitcoin, because copies of all transactions are backed up on and verified by nodes and backed up on the largest supercomputer in the world, so that if they all agree with each other, we reach consensus and blocks get mined. They get rewarded with the new blocks, which allows us to have this fixed monetary policy that can be connected by nobody or controlled by nobody. And at the same time, the centralized network and ledgers, because now all fiat currencies are created by banks on a proof of weapons network, where they benefit from the income that governments used to have. And they started taxing people because they handed it all over to the Federal Reserve and the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, like Bank of America. And Bank of America demonstrated to the world that when you log into your online banking, they just deleted everybody's record. And so because they have a centralized server rather than a distributed server, everybody that logged into their online banking at one point this week had a zero balance, helping people understand the true power of a distributed ledger in cybersecurity attacks and an increasing environment as we enter into currency wars and cyber wars because of the atrocities and the wars that the Federal Reserve is funding, creating enemies for America all around the world, which is compromising national security for Americans as they have disaster after disaster, and they have got no money to send to victims within their countries that are dying through natural disasters, but they've got billions to send to Israel and Ukraine to kill Ukrainians, Palestinians, Russians, and now Israeli people, now that is being escalated as the IDF soldiers go into Lebanon and are being attacked on the ground as well as a result of these invasions that the Proof of Weapons Network is funding. You see how backwards this is? And at the same time, it creates homelessness within America because it's a financial apartheid where those that own stocks and real estate benefit at the expense of those that are deep in debt and going homeless and getting addicted to drugs, maybe because they had to fight a war that was an injustice, like they were with Iraq and Afghanistan. And those are only the overt ones, let alone the 100 covert operations that the CIA executed without any congressional approval. So everyone logged into their online banking and realized that they have zero balance. What could happen next time? Well, maybe the CBDC, when everyone realizes that you got zero balance, it could be replaced by downloading an app, and suddenly to get your balance back, there's a new CBDC there, and that decides which banks survive and which banks go bust. as we saw during the global financial crisis of 2008, where essentially JP Morgan, in collaboration with the Fed, was deciding which banks fail and which banks get to buy them all for pennies on the dollar, using taxpayers' money through fiscal policy and sending them bankrupt in a debt-based Ponzi scheme through monetary policy exerted through the Federal Reserve. So this just shows people why Bitcoin is different and why it is a peaceful resistance against the centralized servers where they can just wipe and replace with a CBDC in extreme circumstances as we transition. Because all banks create money. They are the creators of digital currency, regulated by the Federal Reserve by taking the profits that is meant to be reducing tax and handed over to the private institutions that get to direct the flow of money into their stocks and their real estate. And whenever you can't pay it, because they create this financial apartheid, they get to repossess all of your real estate. And those that get to borrow at 0% from the Federal Reserve through quantitative easing get to be on the right side of the largest wealth inequality, while your government inflation drives you into debt and creates a cost of living crisis. We call it capitalism, and through the IMF, we export it around the world, pretending we're exporting democracy when there is no democracy, because the lobby groups that create the system control the politicians, the intelligence agency execute the missions covertly, and the Federal Reserve benefits and the central banks benefit from all the money creation in the first place, while they delete your balance and pretend nothing to see here, all is good. And when they expand those proof of weapons network in violation of peace agreements, for example, like the peace agreement that ended the Cold War, where it said Ukraine has to be a neutral zone between Russia and Europe, when they violate those agreements by putting bases on Russia's borders and bases on Iran's borders and bases around China's borders, they say they're trying to invade our countries. And they're trying to create terror in our countries. And they're trying to create communism in our countries. And so when that happens, we sanction the shit out of them. We stop them trading with us. We destroy their economies. We implement regime changes that are executed covertly without Congress or transparency. And then what do? We delete the Russian central bank's reserves that are held with the Federal Reserve and just press delete and create a de-dollarization movement that ends up self-imploding the system, because everybody creates the next system on BRICS, which is being escalated so that all of these 106 countries that have joined BRICS, because their governments have been overthrown, or their people have been thrown into civil war, or they have been raped, massacred, and pillaged of all their resources through the IMF, they say, we're fed up of sanctions. We want to use this alternative payment system. And then we get competition, hopefully, because we move to a multipolar world, which is a peaceful resistance with an exit like Bitcoin that can regulate the system by saying, if you mess around and get too oppressive there, we'll exit through Bitcoin. And AI comes along and says, well, we'll create our own currency because you humans are crazy. You're blowing each other up. And you're sending the world to World War III. We will make sure that we do that. So what does the IMF do? Well, the IMF says, El Salvador, you know that Bitcoin strategy? Yeah, the one that Simon Dixon came across and created and designed a structure with all of the different members of the community that work for the Bitcoin office. Shout out to Jack Mallers, shout out to Samson Mao, shout out to Bitcoin Beach, shout out to Max Kaiser, Stacey Herbert, everybody that's been involved in that project. And when I went to meet President Bukele, shared some of the things that I thought were mistakes, like allowing people to withdraw their Bitcoin rather than creating a retirement structure to retirement when they were handing out Bitcoin to everybody, but also restructuring the IMF debt. And Bukele announced, we're no longer taking IMF debt. We want to be independent of the IMF. And suddenly, the IMF urges El Salvador that they need to limit the scope of Bitcoin law. The National Bitcoin Office came out and says that El Salvador is building a new capital market built on top of Bitcoin. And now the IMF needs to warn them. So just like the Bank of England threatened the Isle of Man when the government wanted to become independent of the Bank of England and create a Bitcoin strategy, the IMF are trying to do the same in El Salvador. But thankfully, we have a strong president and a young Congress within El Salvador that is going to resist. And God bless, willing, hopefully we will not see any type of the behavior that the economic hitmen at the IMF and the CIA and Mossad and MI5 and the Bank of England have historically done. But we will make sure if any shenanigans happen, we'll follow the money, because people are already starting to put out different types of things there. But I'll follow the money. I don't follow the words. I follow the money to get to the root. And so far, El Salvador, when you follow the money, they are fighting the IMF. And it is a good fight for everybody to watch and countries to watch. And so back in America, Congressman, let me make sure I get the right name, Ro Khanna says Bitcoin that is seized by the US government should be used as a strategic reserve asset, giving its potential for appreciation. So America, you decide, make sure you hold your politicians accountable. And if you want to know whether Trump does or will drain the swamp, here's what you need to do, as I have covered in previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Release the 9/11 files to expose that your best friends are not your best friends. Release the JFK files that shows that your friends that you think are your friends are not your best friends. And also end the Fed by building a strategic Bitcoin reserve asset. So when you realize what the Fed is trying to do to draw you into World War III and bankrupt your government, as they build the next structure they want to support, you have something to resist against through a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. If Trump does all those things, he does want to drain the swamp. If he doesn't, he is compromised and part of the very same establishment that every single other member of UK and US politics in political interference through Israel and the Israeli lobby as they decide the future of all the politics, because they control the intelligence agencies that are implementing policies for the central banks. That is why we are being driven to World War III and the reversal of all the peace agreements. So let's look into the macro section right now. Firstly, if you're enjoying this, guess what? YouTube doesn't want me to say this. None of the traditional media want to share this. It's only X right now, thanks to Elon Musk, that I am able to say this, and no traffic is given to us, because I used to have hundreds of thousands of people that would watch my videos when YouTube liked my message. Now they don't like it anymore. So do me a favor, like, subscribe, comment, retweet, quote tweet, help spread the message. I want as many people with Bitcoin in self-custody, because our governments are taking us down a path. And I want people to understand it so that we can reverse and peacefully resist against the path our central banks are taking us. So I'm going to have a quick water. Then we're going to go into macro and geopolitics. So do me a favor. Please do that. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So on the macro section, we have all the central banks that are pumping like crazy. Remember in previous broadcasts, I talked about those on the BRICS side. They either have an IMF, which is essentially a bank that goes back to Bank for International Settlements, which is the same network that created the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, and that banking family that creates debt-based Ponzi schemes all around the world. So any member of the Bank for International Settlements, you need to be skeptical of. But the resistance against that from central banks that want to keep their government's ability to profit from seigniorage and not hand it over to the private banking system, have state banking models. And China is one of those countries that has a state banking model. This reduces the amount of tax that people need to pay because the profits from seigniorage are squarely in the hands of state banks. And therefore, they can be used in the interest, of, or more transparently anyway, for that country. But as a result of the stimulus that China is doing and exerting right now, the stock market in China is currently surging. And all of a sudden, all of the different ETFs, all of the different narratives from the traditional financial players, they're saying buy stocks in China. At the same time, what technology is being used for the BRICS cryptocurrency is Enbridge. Enbridge is built upon the Bank for International Settlements technology. The Bank for International Settlements is the same subsidiary that was created after World War I in the transition to World War II, where it was used in order to steal all of Russia's gold, bankrupt the UK government, bankrupt Germany, and create a hyperinflationary cycle. So all of that gold ended up in the Federal Reserve System to fund World War II. And then World War II got all of the beginning of the $35 trillion of debt, as World War II led to Cold War, led to war on terror, and led to all the covert operations and the escalation to what looks very similar to World War III right now by reversing all the peace agreements. But all of the volume that is being stimulated is pitching to China, and all of a sudden, all the narratives around the same companies, and the same financial institutions that are shareholders in the Federal Reserve are telling us that you need to diversify across to China. Japan say that they are going to be more accommodative. And so after Japan blew up the system by going against the Fed's policy, by increasing rates, by favoring Japanese people that were suffering from inflation, all of a sudden, all this cheap money that was been using in the debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to buy stocks and keep up the price of US real estate and US stocks, suddenly was not able to be borrowed at 0% interest. They wanted to do another policy up, and basically the Bank of Japan caved to the power of the Federal Reserve and said, we're going to be more accommodative and keep the Ponzi scheme going. And so at the same time, the Fed's Bostic, he's one of the 12, I think, a member of one of the 12 central banks that are a member of FOMC that set the policy that maximizes for the banks that are shareholders of the subsidiaries of the Federal Reserve. He came out and said he is open for another 50 basis point interest rate cut in November, because Mossad and the CIA have decided who is going to be in charge of American politics. You will think that you're voting, but in order to get those, we got this 50 basis points cut, which will pump another debt-based cycle that will get the government deeper and deeper into debt. You'll all be happy if you own stocks and real estate. And in order to support another stimulus, members of the Fed are coming out and saying we'll support more cuts in November. And suddenly all of the numbers for jobs are looking great. So we had the non-farm payroll numbers this week. The unemployment numbers were looking brilliant, but we need to dig a little bit deeper. I haven't done the research, but I want to do it. I haven't had time to do it. Are those jobs coming from the public or private? Because what we are seeing right now is the Fed pumping lots and lots of money to pump real estate in the stock market, which is creating the financial apartheid and the wealth inequality. And then at the same time, we're getting these really interesting messages around AI and a bit of an AI war. So we need to continually watch the AI war and what's happening around there. I haven't figured out the full story yet, but I'll keep making sure I cover it. If you subscribe to my channel, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and hopefully YouTube will message you. And if you join on simondixon.com, I'll make sure you get an email every week so you don't miss any of these important updates as we get that transition. But obviously the leading AI at the moment, which is pushing the price and valuation of NVIDIA through all the demand for all the hardware that's needed to run all this AI, ChatGPT, and that is the creator of, OpenAI that everybody is using. They announced a funding round of $6.6 billion at a $157 billion valuation. But at the same time, as the announcement of the funding round, Apple decided to pull out of the OpenAI investment. And this is right after iPhone 16 launched, in which it announced that it had an OpenAI integration. And at the very same time, we get a massive overhaul of the board at OpenAI when they're saying that it was going to be a for-profit, it was going to be a foundation, then it becomes a full-profit company, and then all of a sudden the board has an overhaul, and then Elon Musk comes out and says OpenAI is evil and ChatGPT is evil. There's some Apple politics going on. As always, I will follow the money and eventually will understand the full picture of what is what is happening here. The board suddenly has an overhaul. AI is clearly being weaponized in the proof of weapons network because we know that it is eventually going to create the CBDC when humans become rendered useless because they break up the system and send us into wars as well. So we're going to codify that whole thing. Now, there will be a resistance movement against that. And we will need a distributed supercomputer to host the open source AI. And guess what? More and more Bitcoin companies are now building their data centers in order to host AI as we get more and more of innovation around decentralized AI, which is a movement that we must follow because decentralized AI, you can bet your bottom dollar, will be picking Bitcoin as a currency because they will pick the best, hardest digital hard sound money as we transition to a world of AI. And we start to see the central banks creating all of these crazy trends, printing more and more money as the companies are investing more and more in AI and not hiring people as they're figuring out how to, because of all the excessive regulations and excessive HR regulations, replace their humans with bots as well. So all of these companies are essentially deciding that with all this AI, and we'll make sure we follow the open source, closed source movement there, and who's overthrowing these different roles, and who the money points back to, and which operations and governments it goes back to, because we know what those different operations were. I'll cover those in future episodes as well as recaps. But the governments are essentially probably picking up those jobs. So is the private sector unemployed, creating more and more unemployment? And is the public sector picking up all those jobs? And whose narrative does that support? Well, the Federal Reserve wants the government to get deeper into debt. So the Federal Reserve prefers communism. And communism means a larger country, government. And as the country employs more and more people, as more and more unemployment happens in the private sector, you get that slow transition that I said, because China has a state banking system rather than a private, controlled Federal Reserve debt-based Ponzi scheme. Every day, China looks more like America. America looks more like China. And you get a narrative driving us into war that you need to protect yourself from the communists, and trade wars happen that take us further and further away from free markets. Understand what's happening here, follow the money, you get a better story. But essentially, they are slowly transitioning more and more jobs over to the public sector. The public sector means you need to lend more and more to the government. And eventually, when people can't have those jobs, you replace it with universal basic income. When you can delete the database at the bank, you can replace it with a CBDC. CBDC can then have all of the optimized negative interest rates for the AI monetary policy that eventually I believe we head as we go into this world dominated by Bitcoin AI and CBDCs. And guess what, my friends? That was exactly how you use the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, to profit the banks through the banking lobby, profit the war machines through the war machine lobby, profit Israel through the Israeli lobby, and then you suddenly get this massive transition from capitalism to communism, which was the exact design of the system when it was designed in England during the interwar period, and that got England into World War I in the first place to bankrupt the UK government and transition the power structure to that new world order from England to America, which essentially was that interwar period and the prior period and the after period that I've covered in previous broadcasts that's so important to follow. But anyway, we're going to get more and more trade and tariffs. And speaking of which, the subsidiary, the end plan in order to take over the German central bank when it created hyperinflation in that interwar period, when there was a resistance against that and it moved to a non-debt-based monetary system. And then we ended up with the end of the German system after World War II. Suddenly, we had Europe that started to build the system after the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and replace the German debt-based monetary system with the European Central Bank. But there was only one bank that opted out, which is the Bank of England, because that is at the heart and soul of the power structure. So now you have ECB, Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve. And we get announcements right now, today, in fact, that the European Union is deciding that they're going to implement massive tariffs and trades on China in order to make sure that the people don't get cheap electric cars. And so rather than favoring the people that need cheaper goods because they're suffering a cost of living crisis, instead, they use the ECB, they use trade and tariffs policy in order to make sure that none of those cheap cars get into China. And so we are hearing announcements that will follow the money. They are negotiating better solutions than tariffs and trades. But remember, the German economy was destroyed through gas because America implemented the terrorist attack on the Nord Stream pipeline between Germany and Russia, and then implemented all the sanctions and financial weapons of mass destruction that got the German economy and all the members of EU deep into debt into the European Central Bank, as the European Central Bank executes the bankruptcy of all of those countries within EU that had their own debt-based Ponzi schemes and gave it all up to the power of one centralized ECB. As a result of that, we're starting to see oil is slightly up, but remember how centralized we become. The oil price is controlled by Saudi Arabia. MBS can decide, do I want to favor Putin or Biden, which is what he did during the last time when the Federal Reserve created transitory inflation, kept rates low, got everyone into debt, then hiked rates, which broke the banking system so that JP Morgan could buy all those banks, and their buddies at Silicon Valley created a bank run. But at the same time, MBS decided, do I want America? Do I want to favor Russia? In that case, he favored Russia. He kept prices high, and Russia was able to fund the resistance against the NATO expansion, led to that invasion. And then we get all the propaganda that there's no violation of peace agreements. Remember, Boris Johnson made sure that there was no negotiation. And suddenly the entire world needs to double their expenditure into the American war machine. All the money that's printed that creates the inflation ends up pumping the price of the war machine stocks as it creates its first front in the war, which is the American-Russian proxy war and the return to the Cold War for profit by the Federal Reserve and the stocks that benefit from the American war machine. So oil is going slightly up, but we shall see. And there's going to be the geopolitics play to find out which side Saudi Arabia wants to sit. And if Saudi Arabia decides that they want to renege the power play over into both the global south and global north, they can either decide to keep oil prices high, or they can decide to keep oil prices low. And we pretend we have markets and everyone gives their analysis around the oil markets. At the same time, there has been a big increase into steel. Steel demand is up because China is up, and China up through the stimulus means that that's about 60% of the demand for steel because they're manufacturing everything. And essentially, we are in the hands of the PBOC, the BRICS cryptocurrency that may be coming out next, and all the different central banks, and Saudi Arabia, which I call essentially the central bank of oil. That is the future of all these markets. Why? Because we allowed the central banks to take over our governments and use a debt-based apartheid and get them deep into debt. But we can all opt out by buying Bitcoin and resist and boycott the central banks, because in 2008, we got our system where you have money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply. So commodity prices are tending to be up at the moment. If commodity prices continue to go up, that means more inflation. The central banks are lowering interest rates to get everyone deeper into debt. they are choosing another inflationary cycle, which is the financial apartheid. At the same time, the traditional financial players like JP Morgan, they're deciding to hedge and make sure everyone gets Bitcoin, but not Bitcoin in self-custody, Bitcoin in the stock market through the ETFs. And so JP Morgan came out. It says that rising geopolitical risks, which the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, Mossad, CIA, and MI5 create, is creating a risk environment could lead to investors favoring gold and Bitcoin as a safe haven asset. And so all the traditional players are making people drain the swamp, end up in Bitcoin and gold. And so they are pumping the price of the gold that's going to back the BRICS cryptocurrency, and also make sure that the bags that the central bank holds, printing more and more money, getting governments deeper into debt, but they're storing their money in gold, which is increasing the demand for gold and the demand for Bitcoin. And you just need to make sure that you own your Bitcoin in self-custody as a resistant movement against it. Why? And that moves us into the geopolitical section. Now we have done the Bitcoin section and the macro section. So if you're enjoying this, please do like, please do share, please do retweet, please do quote tweet, and let me know anything you disagree with, anything you think I got wrong. Shout out to me on Twitter. Put it in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. Sorry, not Twitter, X. And on YouTube, put it in the comment section and let me know. I'm going to take another quick sip of water because we got one more section on the geopolitical section. We've already discussed the war escalating on one front. Now let's discuss the two other fronts that are completely pumping the proof of weapons network to bankrupt our governments and take us into war. So please do repost, tweet, share, X, whatever you know, whatever you can do to support me if you're enjoying this free content. And I'll take a quick water break. I'll be back with you in 1 second. Okay, so let's jump into the geopolitical section. Now, there is a narrative around the election. And so the narrative around the election is that Trump's going to be more pro-Bitcoin and crypto. I agree with that. If you're a one policy voter, Trump is the obvious option if you're American. And so that is one thing. But also there is the war narrative. And Trump, while he has been a person of peace because he's a business person, and if it makes financial sense to him, then he will be a president of peace. And if it doesn't make financial sense because the whole economy is being set up for an American war machine, then you can bet your bottom dollar he will help the narrative, but more covertly on the war side, because it's all about the profit side at the end of the day. And so this is why there is a lot of controversy around Trump. Trump is a bit of a trump card, as it were. You don't know where he's going to go. He's unpredictable. And so I believe those that control the system, the CIA, Mossad, Israel lobby, Bank of England, Federal Reserve, they're more likely to be the people behind the Trump assassination attempt, 2 of them so far. And so we have 2 different narratives. One, it could be fake in order to drive popularity because he is the chosen one. Or it may be that someone's out to genuinely get him, because we had another 3rd rumor of an assassination attempt as well that was being perpetuated in only Israeli media and social media too. It didn't make its way to the Western media for some reason. So what does that mean? How do we interpret that? So firstly, Trump is being perceived as the one that will end the war with Ukraine. And I actually believe he will, because he has a relationship with Putin. He understands that this is just benefiting the American war machine, but it is ruining relationships in what could be a nuclear war and World War III and the end of the world, quite frankly, if anyone fires a nuke. And so I think he wants to get peace and end the scam that this Ukraine war is, that is killing ordinary Ukrainians, ordinary Russian people, and demonizing any type of multipolarity, because the hegemony of the US dollar is a war machine. We end the war by having competition, and the regulation of that and competition comes from Bitcoin by exiting the central banking system. That's how we get a peaceful transition. Hegemony is absolute power corrupts absolutely. And remember, the creators of the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and the Rothschild family always said, I care not if I control the money, give me the power to control the money, I care not who writes the laws. And that has played out as well. But also, there is a narrative that the way that the Israeli lobby is controlling Trump at the moment is he is essentially playing into the narrative that the world needs to go to war with Iran. And there will be a lot of MAGA people that will take what he says and take that as gospel. And so if you want to create a civil war within America, you can galvanize the support that Trump has, and you can create a series of events that means that if, and God willing, this doesn't happen, but if the powers that be decide that Trump needs to go, they can galvanize that because Trump is pushing an anti-Iran narrative right now. And we got to really ask those questions. So rumors came out on Israeli media and on social media that there was a third assassination attempt at Trump. And the rumors were that missiles are heading for Air Force One and they were smuggled through the open border and they are in America in the control of Iran. And they're spreading the narrative that Iran controls the media and Iran is interfering in US politics. Every accusation is a confession when it comes to Israel government and Mossad, because they're the ones that do all of that. And there is a deep history of American presidents trying to resist against the power of the Israeli lobby, the secret assassination attempts of the CIA and Mossad. And you just need to read the book. By the way, a few books, if you just want to dig into my world. Read The Israeli Lobby, great book. Read Confessions of an Economic Hitman by the great book. Read Covert Regime Change that explains all the CIA operations to take out, install dictators into countries so that they can control them and take over their resources. And I've covered on my blog a 3-part series on the history of investment banking, Bitcoin, and various other things. Feel free if you want to binge. I'm creating all the information anyway. This is just where we cover this week's events as well. But Israeli media covered that it is saying this is revenge because in Trump 4 years ago ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Iran decided not to retaliate too aggressively because they didn't want to go to war with US. It attacked some of the illegal occupations that America has in Iraq and Syria. So there is illegal US bases in Iraq and Syria. That is how America funds the CIA outside of Congress, by taking over those oil resources and creating a slush fund where they can direct flows of money to organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS in order to fund the fake wars on terrorists and make the 2 billion Muslims look like crazy people, because Mossad had an operation where you need to believe that Iran is the enemy of all things. Because if you don't like the Iran government, I don't like IRGC, I don't like any governments, but you can use that narrative in order to create a dislike, which creates racism within your country, Islamophobia, and then you can play upon the different weaponized narratives like Israel's obsession over anti-Semitism to weaponize the Jewish people into thinking they're in a fight for their life, they need to join the IDF, and they need to engage in these wars by moving to Israel and ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people, while the US and UK use their media networks to hide everything and make you think that Iran is your enemy, China is your enemy, and Russia is your enemy. And they are doing that through trying to install communism and trying to terrorize your people. And then they implement false flag operations to make you think you are in danger. Well, anyway, one of those assassinations by Trump was Qasem Soleimani 4 years ago. And because Iran doesn't want to go to war with the US, because that will be a disaster and only fuel the American war machine, support the stocks, Netanyahu is ramping up a narrative exactly in line with how Netanyahu presented in Congress in America, where he got 56 round of applauses, because he needs you to believe that America and American troops need to go to war with Iran. This is right before Iran responded to the August attack. So they're saying that Iran is responding, and because of an assassination attempt 4 years ago, and therefore in the Congress, Netanyahu said it's Iran that's trying to assassinate Trump. It's not a Mossad operation. It's not Israel that benefits from it, because what does Israel want? Israel wants you to believe that Iran's the enemy so that America can join the war. And if America joins the war, it can achieve its stated goal of destabilizing and detoppling the Middle East. And America benefits from that because it gets the oil resources, which why it originally engaged in the 1953 covert operation with the Brits and with the UK and US in order to take out Iran, that wanted to nationalize its oil rather than giving it to America and UK in the first place. And US and UK foreign policy is implemented through the criminal government, Israel. No reflection of the people, the criminal government. The criminal government is tricking people in US, UK, and the Western world and Israel to think that they need to all fight each other and kill each other as well. But anyway, Israel is trying to get the US to fight a war with Iran. Now, that's my narrative. That's based upon following the money, not listening to the words. And so if you believe the monetary flows, then you will come to a similar story as well. So then you have to ask, who would benefit from assassinating Trump? And so if Trump, God, I do not want this to happen, but I've seen it too many times, that if the third attempt at Trump's life does lead to that, then Trump has said, blame Iran. Netanyahu has said, blame Iran. But Israel benefits from the whole thing because you will be told you need to go to war with Iran to avenge it. And you will likely see a false flag operation, which we have seen throughout Israeli's history, where they terrorize British and American people in order to make you think that it is another enemy. And then they try to make you think that anyone resisting against Israel or resisting against America and UK stealing their oil is a crazy, irrational terrorist that wants to take your life away because they've got their organizations that they fund, like ISIS, to try and confuse the world into thinking any resistance is the same thing. So Israel is currently justifying the war with Iran by bombing Lebanon. So Iran policy, again, don't interpret this as me being a fan of the Iranian government. I don't want regime change. I want peace. And peace comes from the China plan. The China plan says we don't want US bases in the Middle East anymore. We want a two-state solution, or we want equal rights for all Jewish, Muslims, and Christians in those regions that are in conflict. And we want to normalize between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We want to normalize between Ukraine and Russia. And we don't want to reunify because the bases in Japan and all of these different islands that are surrounding China right now don't require us to think that there is a threat. And all those bases surrounding Iran and those bases surrounding Russia, they're no longer there. And we can just trade with each other. And we don't need to engage in a trade war anymore. That is China's peace plan. But America is escalating every war on three different fronts. Again, it's because government's not in control. It's because the Federal Reserve and the CIA and Mossad and the Bank of England and MI5 are in control. Okay, so for 20 years, the Iranian policy has been that they want to avoid war with the US. It's not a war that they can win. It's destructive. And so because Israel has essentially been engaging in that narrative for over 40 years and telling the world that you need to go to war with Iran, which was the reason why US foreign policy was taken over, and you went to all these fake wars under fake weapons of mass destruction, and you had regime changes where you funded, and the Federal Reserve funded supporting Saddam Hussein to go to war with Iran, and then that led to all the bases that surround Iran, and we take over all of its oil resources like we are in Iraq and Syria. We detopple and destabilize the whole region. Israel's policy for 40 years has been the world needs to think that Iran is the one you need to go to war with and take out. So for 20 years, Iran has been trying to negotiate, and they only increase their nuclear program and their defense program because it is being surrounded and it wants a defense, because it is being regime changed. And so it's a natural thing. And that's why there was an Iranian revolution. And it's why America, if you read all these covert regime changes, wants dictators in charge. They want dictators in charge. Who is America allied with? All of the kingdoms and the dictators. They're not trying to export democracy. The revolution was an attempt to get to democracy away from a kingdom with a US-friendly dictator that was pillaging all of the oil resources. Follow the money, you get to the truth. And so with Iran basically out of the picture, we had a presentation from Netanyahu of what the world looks like. What was his presentation? I watched the whole presentation. Did you? Well, the presentation from Netanyahu, by the way, all of the countries that want freedom, which is 145 different members, they're all voting for a Palestinian self-determination and to end the massacre of Palestinian people and for them to have self-determination. And only one country, America, is voting it. So there can be no peace in the Middle East. Every single year, America's veto voted it. UK used to, but now they've capitulated. Now it's just American left. Netanyahu came in. All of the members walked out because they know he's lying about everything. And he presented the map of what the future vision for the Greater Israel project looks like. He said that the Middle East can either be dominated by the cursed Iran or the blessed Israel. So he admits that this is about Middle Eastern domination, and Mossad is simply the ones that has bribed all of the American politicians, all of the US politicians, created bribery networks like AIPAC that directs all money to political funding, and Epstein, which bribes politicians if they can't get the political funding there. And then you suddenly get people that have an end the Fed bill like Thomas Massie, not connecting all the dots. I don't know what happened, but suddenly when he implements the end the Fed bill, his wife goes the same place that JFK went when JFK launched a currency to end the Fed and launched a policy to end Israel's interference in US politics and launched a requirement to end the illegal, uninspected nuclear program of not Iran, but Israel. And then because all of the negotiations fell through, Israel foreign policy is funding the war machine that creates the financial apartheid in America. And we are led to believe, because they have freedom of speech, and I'll use my freedom of speech until I don't have it anymore, we are led to believe that because it feels great in America, other than the financial apartheid with freedom of speech, that the foreign policy is just as good. It's mafiosa, complete occupation through central banking of governments to get them into debt in order to fund wars and destroy economies. That's why I love Bitcoin. That's why Bitcoin is about geopolitics. That's why you have to understand macro to follow the money. And that's why I will not stay in my lane and just talk about cryptocurrency pump and dump schemes, because some people said, stay distracted, Simon. Talk about Bitcoin. I want you to make me more dollar wealthy, not Bitcoin wealthy. I'm not interested in your political views on peace. That's what Bitcoin was created for, because I was there when it was 100 people sat in a room and a resistance movement against the 2008 financial crisis, where we were given this gift that was brought down to us to create the ability to own our own home, spend our own money, and resist the central banks and resist the inflation. And I got blessed with complete financial freedom and was given a gift that meant I don't need any funding for my company, so I don't need to be distracted by the VCs that want me to go on a different mission. I don't need to be distracted by lobby money. I can just talk the truth because Bitcoin gave me the freedom, and I want that Bitcoin in self-custody in the hands of as many people as possible that actually understand the psyop that is happening right in front of us. And that is why I will not stay in my lane and just talk about cryptocurrency pump and dump schemes so you can make some more dollars out of a meme scheme that ain't going to make any difference in the world. Bitcoin changes everything, fix money, fix the world. And if you haven't figured out that money is related to macro and geopolitics and all of this wars that we are fighting, then you haven't figured out why Bitcoin was created. And I was there when it was only 100 people. I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference when it was a movement against central banking. I wrote the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. It wasn't called Buy Bitcoin. It was called Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust, because I was sharing how central banks and governments can free themselves from the debt-based fiat currency, proof of weapons network, Ponzi schemes. And I will write the book again because it was written in 2011 next year when I get a chance. And I will create the video series to help people how to self-custody and protect themselves next year. And I will keep giving content on Bitcoin macro and geopolitics so that every single week, less people are watching the media, less people are getting massacred, and less people are thinking that these illegitimate mafioso financial institutions that are bankrupting our governments and making huge governments that are funding war machines through debt-based Ponzi schemes and financial apartheid are legitimate financial institutions, because no one can see through the weed and see the money and follow the monetary flows. I need as many of you that understand that as well. So what does Netanyahu want? He wants to eliminate Iran because he wants to control the oil. And America and UK benefit from it because it is a non-governmental criminal network run by intelligence agencies and the money printing of the central banks. This is a US covert regime change war machine to take out Iran and its allies so that you can think you have improved the war on terror. But guess what creates terrorism in the first place? People where they have been killed in wars and are manipulated by Mossad and CIA in order to be armed and militarized in order to make you think that the world is different to how it actually is, so that these operations and criminal organizations like the government of Israel, like the Bank of England, and like the Federal Reserve are legitimate institutions, and everything that we value as humans is being taken away from us because of that. So that Israel can control the oil in the Middle East, it can control all the shipping routes, and when the Houthis in Yemen are resisting against that, we're told they're the terrorists. And so it can control the entire nuclear program, that there is only one country in the world that does not follow all the international norms around nuclear inspections and nuclear proliferation. And they're gaslighting by saying that's what Iran are doing when they create a defense against it and already had a nuclear deal to have all those inspections, when Israel is the one that doesn't follow all the norms and should be sanctioned. Wake up. And when you understand how this criminal government was created in the first place, I'm not going to go into it right now, I've covered it in previous episodes, you realize that this was just one division of lawlessness in the central banking criminal network that weaponized the faith of Judaism to scam people, and the faith of Islam to scam people, and the faith of Christianity in order to scam people, in complete violation of what those books and beautiful faiths were meant to do in the first place. So that you can all think, betray God. It must be God that does it. Anyway, they also want to control AI. Guess where all the AI and cybersecurity comes from? It's coming from Israel. How did they blow up all those pages? How are they controlling all of the different devices? How do they have major intelligence that is blowing up members of the resistance in Lebanon right now, in Yemen right now, in Gaza right now, in West Bank right now, in Iraq right now, in Syria right now, and how are they, and in Iran right now? all of the allies that are resisting the rapage and pillaging and killing of their people. Again, I'm no fan of the government, but we can never have peace unless we can have truth. So at the moment, Iran is the only serious backer of the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian cause is the condition that Hamas was negotiating. They said, we want a hostage swap because Israel had 10,000 hostages that they call prisoners. And they also said that they would like Palestine to have a two-state solution as per the 2017 Hamas Charter. Read it rather than what the media is telling you that it says. I read it. I can see what it says. It's a resistance against the criminal organization that was created around the Israeli government by the Brits and Americans, which were when their government was co-opted by the intelligence agencies and the CIA and the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. This is an intelligence pot of deceit. It's either CIA, Mossad, or both. And you need to believe that the false flag operations are Iran's fault so that America can go to war. And that is why we're getting escalation rather than negotiation. What did Hezbollah say? Hezbollah said, we will stop as soon as Palestine is free. America said, we want a two-state solution. And yet every single UN meeting, Security Council veto votes a two-state solution. Follow the money, not the words. We know that this is what's stopping peace. Israel, America, UK getting in the way of Palestine self-determination. Why don't they want Palestine self-determination? Because this is all about the money of the network that they want to create of deceit around you by detoppling and destabilizing anyone that gets in the way while they have an illegal nuclear force, because this is all about energy, nuclear, and it's spilling over to Russia and China because they also are having their peace agreements reversed, which created the economy where we were all trading with each other and everything was working well. Anyway, who has Iran supported? It supported Yemen. It supported Syria, a regime change, covert regime change in Yemen. Destroyed, Syria because there was a covert regime change by the US in both Yemen and Syria. There was a covert regime change in Iraq. There was a covert regime change in Palestine when the Brits declared to Lord Rothschild, the Zionist entity in 1917, gave Palestine to the Zionist entity. And then the word Israel was used to confuse all people because of the religious connotation to a prophet and a people. They also are now destroyed Lebanon. Where was Hezbollah created in the first place? It was Lebanese people that were fighting an invasion by Israel in 1982 into Lebanon. And they went across to Syria when Syria was detoppled to fight ISIS. Why is Iran backing Hezbollah to fight ISIS when we're meant to believe that ISIS is the crazy terrorist of Hezbollah, which is the resistance, and Hamas? Please do not interpret this as me supporting any group that my country or UK or US says we are legally not allowed to support. I just want you to understand the flow of money so that you can understand how you get to peace, because without truth, we can never have peace. They also detopple Jordan in order to push 3 million Palestinians into that territory. They also get rid of UNRWA, which is maintaining the rights for those Palestinians to return back to the occupied territory. And if you can blow it up by saying it's connected to October the 7th, then the right to return disappears, while me, as somebody that has a Jewish mother, is able to take somebody else's land and live in an illegal settlement based upon and receive guns in order to terrorize Palestinians and root them out of their homes in the West Bank while they're not allowed to return. Get it? If America, UK, and Israel wanted peace, they would free Palestine and everything would go backwards from there. And we could have equal rights for Jewish people, Christian people, atheist people, Muslim people in the land that was created all this mess to destabilize the region in the first place. They also topple parts of, they also have support in parts of Saudi Arabia, which is why Saudi Arabia has to have an agreement with the US. The money then goes back to the US to support their, the American war machine as well. Billions of dollars of oil, which was, originally it was the Brits taking over Saudi Arabia's oil. Then America wanted, and then Saudi Arabia decided to resist Britain. So they started working with America. Now America did part of the expeditions, and they enter into an agreement for defense because the kingdom and dictatorship doesn't want to be detoppled. So you're not exporting democracy. You're not improving human rights violations. There's all sorts of human rights violations, just as bad as what you're told happens in China and Iran, in Saudi Arabia. But when you follow the money, you realize it's just one big psyop to believe something different. And so what happens in Iran as well, let's get it back to where we are today. A revolutionary guard decides to resist against it. So you have the 79 revolution. And guess what? They install a democracy. We're told that that democracy is atrocities, human rights violations, and you need to defend it. Look, I get that there's human rights violations. That's every struggle against their government to do that. But you can see that when the president was taken down in a helicopter, nothing to do with an assassination. When he was taken down in the helicopter, there was a democratic process to hire the next president. What did that president want to do? Immediately he said, we want to do a nuclear deal and we want to bring back ties with America so that we can get rid of the sanctions. That's the stated goal. But we cannot, while there is Israel, a nuclear force, and American bases all around us, we have to continue building a military-industrial complex to defend. And that is what happened recently. So now let's look about it. So Netanyahu comes in the United Nations where he holds up a map saying, here's the evil and here's the blessed. Everybody should work with the blessed. And in order to do that, wipe Palestine off the map, wipe Yemen off the map, write Iran off the map at the end of this whole thing, and let's get on with it. He calls it the Abraham Alliance. It's Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan. And they're the same countries that are able to defend Israel with American money that costs billions of dollars that is creating the inflation in the UK in order to protect this criminal organization regime called the Israeli government. Because all they need to do is free Palestinian people if people want peace. Just don't fall for it. So now we're in the third war between Lebanon and Israel. Third time we've seen this. The first time was in 1982. That created Hezbollah in the first place. The second time was in 2006. And both were absolute catastrophes for Israel because Hezbollah was built in fighting against ISIS, an intelligence agency subsidiary of Israel and America, to make Muslims look like terrorists. And when they fight against that, they became very battled. But in order to destroy Lebanon, Israel needed to get very aggressive. So they decided to get additional aggression. The media tells you that this is aggression from Hezbollah, Iran, their proxies. We're told that Iran has this nuclear program when they wanted a nuclear deal, which was negotiated so that they could have a defense against all of this aggression. And they want to do that from intervention from oil. And, by overthrowing their leadership, we end up where we are today. So if you listen to the president, he wants to go back to the nuclear deal, which is the stated goals. But Israel doesn't want that to happen. And this is why we had the escalation of foreign policy from US. Because Israel, when there was a deal between US and Iran for peace, and a reduction in sanctions, Israel freaks out. And America has to, not American government, no Congress decision, the powers that be above it, get to change the face of the Middle East forever. Now, so what could possibly happen next? So we've had this escalation. As a quick recap, we had the walkie-talkies, which is an intelligence agency to wipe out 3,000 people, mass civilian casualties from that. Some people say it was, within the terms of engagement. Others call it a terrorist attack. We have the war on narratives. The same happens with the pagers and walkie-talkies. Then suddenly leaders are taken out. Iran has specifically said the terms of engagement is Hezbollah said Palestine needs to be free. Hamas has said two-state solution and hostage swap. Because that's not happening, Hezbollah is involved. Hezbollah says Palestine self-determination. Iran is funding the cause. And we then get attempted assassinations across the leaders in Iran, taking away sovereignty and all of the rules. Same in Lebanon. And now Lebanon is suddenly looking like a death zone as well. What happened last time as well? So, last time Iran responded to the assassination attempt of Qasem Soleimani, Iran responded by targeting US illegal occupations in Iraq and Syria. They know that. The game of Israel is to escalate so that then Iran says, any escalation, we will respond. And if you escalate again to our response, we will double up. So now Israel has got Iran on the escalation cycle by assassinating all of these people rather than negotiating what the Israeli people want, which is return of hostages, which the Israeli government doesn't want because they want to choose escalation so they can get US into the war. So Iran will retaliate by targeting US bases in Iraq and Syria. And that brings US into the war. There is more and more troops there. More and more of that is happening. Now, what happens with Syria? So America responds. Now, the last time when there was a joint effort against ISIS, which involved Iran and Russia as well, and America, to take out ISIS because of the terrorism, the real terrorism that you're meant to believe is the same as a resistance, there is a port in Syria. And in order for Russia to join, they looked at their strategic interests and they ended up with a port in Syria, which strategically is very important for them. This is the foundation of the Iran-Russia relationship. And, so when you get escalation into Syria, you can escalate it where the port in Syria is taken out. That brings Russia into the escalation. What has Russia said the terms of engagement are? Russia said, if you, UK and US, allow Ukraine and the US proxy to fire long-range missiles into Russia, which helps the American military-industrial complex, then we will escalate towards nukes. And we will take every dollar that you're funding into this NATO expansion that's killing Ukrainians and pushing Russia into its illegal invasion as well as a defensive move that the media is portraying as complete, colonialism to take over the entire of the entire Europe. They said that they will militarize Iran because Iran is protecting the border in Syria and Russia needs that as a strategic asset. So why did Israel escalate? And why did it go to Lebanon? Because this is the creep of escalation to draw US into the war so that US can then fight Russia, so the military-industrial complex can benefit. And if oil price goes through the roof, who does that benefit? Iran and Russia, who are net exporters to China. And China has a strategic relationship, which is the third front that they are betraying all the peace agreements with. So rather than sticking to the agreements of a one China policy, they're saying we're going to make Taiwan independent. That is escalatory because that's what led to the peace agreement before. So is this really America's government acting in America's best interest? Is this the UK government acting in the UK's best interest? Hell no. This is not being debated in Parliament or Congress. This is a criminal organization that benefits from war and getting governments deep into debt, which is the central banks. And that's what they were created for in the first place. But we're led to believe that they've got our back. Let's look at the previous so we can understand the PSYOP as well. Israel has essentially been using this strategy for a long time, escalating, taking over land, and then using that land in order to negotiate peace agreements. This is what they've been doing for 50 years. The peace agreement means you need to take money from the IMF through loans so that they can control the currency of that country. You have to install a regime change, a puppet government for the US. And if everything goes wrong, we get to nationalize all your resources and create civil war within your country. So all those countries, they tapped out and did that. What is the October the 7th? The October the 7th is the 50-year anniversary of something that happened on October the 6th, the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was a 50-year celebration where basically Israel implemented this strategy of strategically expanding and taking over land to negotiate peace agreements so that the IMF could take over the economic hitman mission. And then those could be used to funnel money into the Israeli lobby to take over US politics so that the government can go deeper into debt based upon taking over the dollar in a debt-based Ponzi scheme that creates the financial apartheid. This happened with Egypt, essentially. Land was given back to Egypt, and they said, but you need to go to debt into the IMF, and you need to keep the kingdom alive and the dictatorship. Don't have a democracy. What else did they do? They gave back the West Bank to Jordan, and then they illegally occupied it. The ICJ says that this is an illegal occupation and you need to retreat. What did they do? They expanded illegal settlements to create violence in the West Bank and expand their territory so that they can negotiate this division, let's call it, of the Federal Reserve to fund the American war machine. Eventually, they were meant to give back the Golan Heights to Syria in order to normalize with Syria, but the Assad regime said, we're not doing that. So Assad creates all these atrocities in order to defend, and I'm not saying, there are people that were got in the middle of those atrocities. Again, don't interpret this as me saying the Syrian government are good and I'm a fan of these regimes, because I'm not. But understand what's happening is the people struggle against their own regime, and this war is created through destabilization and taking over of resources. And we're led to believe that colonialism is over. No, the US empire has an homogeneous power that is protecting the petrodollar for the debt-based Ponzi scheme of the Federal Reserve that's creating a financial apartheid that is leading to disastrous results for American people. This led to Camp David, where all these negotiations were happened, which is essentially installing the puppet governments of America and debt-based slavery of the regimes through the IMF. And this led to the peace treaty with Jordan, which returned land. This led to the Oslo Accords 1 and 2, where we're led to believe that there is a two-state solution, but Israel never follows through on those agreements because it is not an honest negotiation in the first place. There was never meant to be a two-state solution because America veto votes it. Just follow the money and what they do, not what they say in the media. What happens then? They implement an extremist government within Israel. They assassinate their own president when their president wants peace. We then get the Likud party. The Likud party comes into Israel in the 80s and 90s. If you read the Likud doctrine, it is worse than anything you've seen in the Hamas Charter. It is about no negotiation of peace, expansion of illegal settlements, and these are the governments that sit behind Netanyahu right now. Netanyahu is the one that is like the polished turd to make you think that Israel, the Israeli government is good and that everything needs to go to war with Iran. You get behind, you look at the people that are actually expanding the Likud party. They're the ones that are doing terrorism right now. And they're the ones that are in charge. And we're meant to believe that this is some kind of peaceful regime. Just read the Likud doctrine. I read it. Don't take what you get. They came into power, and what did they do? They had expanded illegal settlement. They terrorized Palestinians. They threw them out of their house. They sent guns to all of the terrorists in the Israeli that have been, the Israeli people, in order to expand land that is disputed territory. Why do they want to do that? So they can take it over and then they can legitimize it. That's why there is resistance groups. That's why Hezbollah exists with the Lebanese people. That's why Hamas exists with the Palestinian people. See the trickery. They wanted Syria back because Syria has a bunch of energy. Israel wants to be energy independent. America covers up for it through the media control, through the lobby money. Follow the money, it tells you the truth. This is what led to the Lebanese resistance in the first place. And now, because there are some people within Lebanon that are anti-Hezbollah, they may not know certain parts of the history, or they just want peace. So what's the purpose of expanding this? To create a civil war. If you create a civil war, that's exactly what happened in Syria. You turn everyone against each other. Then you install terrorist organizations like ISIS, and then a resistance movement comes against it. Boom. You've taken over the territory, and then you give it back by saying, Lebanon, restructure your debt with the IMF. Lebanon, let's nationalize your resources. And Lebanon, those oil fields? They're now America and Israel. And guess who benefits from the debt? The Federal Reserve, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements. And guess what? You need to implement our monetary policy. And the debt-based Ponzi scheme continues until it's no longer useful. You print your currency. We protect ourselves by owning gold. We make sure our financial institutions adjust to Bitcoin. And then we plan the next power structure as we destroy and topple and conquer. Israel wanted oil. That's it. That's what this is about. Israel wanted independence, and then they built their illegal nukes that they stole from America. And when anyone calls that out, the US president has a coup. US had a coup in 1963 when JFK was assassinated. And then suddenly the policy is switched within that country, any country, to divide and conquer. This is US foreign policy to keep up the occupation of America by the Federal Reserve. This is the CIA covert regime changes. Read the books. Follow the money. Stop reading the media. Follow me on BitcoinHardTalk. I'll read the books for you and report them back, but stop engaging in the psyop. This is how they split up Syria. We've seen this a million times. This is how they split up Iraq. This is why US bases are in Iraq and Syria. This is why the oil has been taken over. This is how they fund regimes that happen outside of Congress and Parliament. This is how they are currently splitting up Lebanon. This is how they split up Egypt before and got it into debt to the IMF. This is what created October the 7th in the first place, where Israel does not want to return the hostages, and why there is there is protests within Israel because they're saying, why don't you want to return those hostages? Why were these negotiations here? There was a report in CNN that before they assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah was willing to put down the weapons and negotiate peace and move towards a two-state solution that America says is just around the corner. And so what do? They assassinate Hassan Nasrallah. Just like they did with the person that was negotiating the peace in Hamas. Assassinate him within Iran as Iran's guest. Escalate. That's why the people in Israel are protesting against their government. This is why we all need to resist our government, but without truth, we can have no peace. We have to agree on what the issue is here right now. And that is why I Bitcoin, because I want people to exit the central banking system so we can drain the swamp for real. And countries can do what El Salvador is doing and screw you to the IMF. And they can stop being victims of covert regime change operations that handed over all the profits from money creation to the central bank that creates these financial apartheids. So why are they lying about everything that happened on October the 7th? Why are they using atrocity propaganda? You know why? Because you need to believe that the resistance is ISIS. Get it? And when you dig deep into all of this, you realize that there's control of media that is making us think the world is not as it is. And we're all distracted with all the crisis that's happening through the cost of living crisis. There is natural disasters happening in America right now. You're wondering why your government's not sending and supporting American people while they're supporting sending money to Ukraine, and while they're supporting sending money to Israel, and they're supporting sending escalating on the third front in Asia surrounding China as well, telling you that this communist regime, this evil regime, why are they even called a regime? Why is there no Israeli regime? Why is there no American regime, which is the CIA and Federal Reserve? Why is there no UK regime, which is the Bank of England and MI5? Because you need to feel a certain way. Why do they not have the right to defend when they are being raped and pillaged? Because you need to believe that it's called terrorism because there is a fake war on terror, a fake war on communism, and it was all created by the central banks occupying debt-based Ponzi scheme. Fix money, fix the world, wake up people. Anybody that knows this stuff and is complicit in covering up for our governments is now a part of the problem and part of the violence, and they're not taking us toward peace. Once you know, you know. You only know when you follow the money and turn off the media. Okay. This is what they did when the US implemented, they had a puppet regime in there, and Israel wants to detopple the Palestinian Authority, which was a US puppet regime, because Israel and America then start thinking of their own self-interest and start things. So this is why West Bank turned into violence, because they had a process that was working. And they replaced it with the Likud directive, which was expand illegal settlements and give guns to terrorists in Israel to terrorize the Palestinian. And they're doing the same. And this is what the operation within Hezbollah and Lebanon is right now. Now, I covered this on Mario's space, and I said that there is going to be a civil war within Lebanon and Israel is being aggressive, and they're either going to do two things. In order to control Hezbollah, they're going to create a new illegal occupation like they did in West Bank, or they're going to bomb the shit and turn Lebanon into Gaza and mass civilian casualties. And I was called an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, and because my mother is Jewish, the people that live in these illegal occupations said to me, "You're a self-hating Jew." Wake up, people. Eventually, Israel may get its way where Iran ends up in a direct conflict with US. The US and the UK, they pretend that they are negotiating peace and that they tried a nuclear deal, but this crazy psychopathic government is trying to take over the world, and they pretend that they don't know what Israel is doing when the whole time they are in this together. Both Hamas and Hezbollah have stated, whether you believe them or not, and I'm sure they've got their evil. I mean, look what's happened to these people. If you were in a building and you went to the supermarket and you came back and someone blew up your house and killed your children, what would you do? What would you do? And you knew the government was being detoppled for bad reasons, what would you do? Instead of negotiating, instead of engaging in diplomatic ties, our Western people and our Western media want to take the moral high ground, cover up for what's happening, and create more war instead. This machine, the American war machine that is controlled by the central banks, wants war. That's why all of the peace agreements are being portrayed and the media is painting a different story. The US and the UK regime, and I'm not talking about the government, will profit from all of this. And they will get the government deeper and deeper into debt in order to boost the economy. And America will benefit because they'll protect the petrodollar and ensure that there is artificial demand through Saudi Arabia, who controls the main oil supplies, where it is built upon US dollar. And anyone that resists that suddenly gets detoppled. And that's why we're having this BRICS movement, because they all get sanctioned. And instead of being sanctioned, they pull their resources together. In October, we get the BRICS currency in order to create competition that maybe could bring us back to peace. and we get the resistance movement in 2008, where Satoshi Nakamoto built Bitcoin. And in the Bitcoin part, they're trying to tell you, no, it's a CIA operation when it's open source code. Understand the psyops, ask the questions. We're in an information war. Now, so Israel needs you to believe that if Trump gets assassinated, if there's a third attempt or Trump does get assassinated, I don't want that. But if he does, they need you to believe it's Iran. At the same time as believing that what Israel is doing is legitimate operations and that they want the peace and that they are the victims. And yes, there are many victims that are caught up in this psyop. But until we stand against it, we can't have peace. So they're going to occupy Lebanon now. They're going to turn it into West Bank. And there is already mass civilian casualties and lies across the media. Iran said they would retaliate. Iran puts out a telegraph to America, to the forces. Iran takes 3 to 4 weeks to retaliate. Iran then sends weapons that are sent at military targets. They then send ballistic missiles to demonstrate they can break the Iron Dome. Some of them get intercepted, and tragically, that kills one Palestinian life in West Bank. They make you think that they're trying to kill Palestinians. No Israeli deaths happened because they know they don't want civilian casualties within Israel because that would be disaster. That's what Israel wants. Israel wants civilian casualties within Israel because that serves the agenda of escalation to push Iran into escalating further. And so we saw those missiles. And how was it reported in the media? It was reported that a terrorist regime launched unprovoked ballistic missiles in order to inflict massive civilian casualties because they are funding militia terrorist groups, Hezbollah and Hamas, that want to kill the Jews, and Israel wants nothing more than peace. That's what you get from BBC. That's what you get from the cover-up agents on Spaces. That's what you get everywhere. Because the PSYOP, and there are people that are just genuinely caught up in the PSYOP because we're good people at the end of the day. Everyday average people are good people. We don't want death. My whole life has changed because I've seen a genocide in real time. And I've seen that it's a cover-up operation. And I've seen that it's my money that is funding it. And I've seen that I can only talk about it because I'm one of the only people that I know that got complete independence and freedom from my business, from my financial situation, and from my platform, because Bitcoin gave that to me and I hold it in self-custody and everyone else can do the same. Anyway, this whole goal and everything is to draw Iran in. This is so that Israel can escalate, because Israel will escalate and double whatever Iran stuff. So now we are waiting for the escalation. And then Iran has now said enough is enough. I will double the escalation. And then US needs to come in because Israel on their own cannot take on the military might that has been built. They have amazing intelligence. Trust me, US, UK, and Israel are built top of the world intelligence, but invading is very difficult. So this brings the US in. And what does the US do? Well, we've got hundreds of thousands of ballistic missiles under the ground in Iran. And we will target the US base, if US joins this, with the illegal occupations in Iraq and Syria. And then within Iraq and Syria, you then have the base. The base brings Russia into the equation. Russia needs to protect its strategic asset and its port within Syria. This drives a complete regional war. This drives a complete world war. And who is it win-win for? Who benefits? The Fed, which gets to take excessive debt to America. Those that own the stocks that benefit from the war machine. And Israel that then gets to be the US proxy and the sole military might and take out all the resistance and wipe out the Palestinian people altogether and fulfill the homogenous protection of oil and become oil independent and energy independent, and have the media to justify and make it sound like this is a noble cause of protection and an anti-terrorist operation that is meant to be defense. You just need to listen to Smoldrich and Gavir, the extremists of the Israeli government, that believe that suddenly articles 2 weeks before the Lebanese operation and expansion was put out in Israeli media where Gavir said, backed by, the weaponization of the Jewish faith, that Lebanon was originally promised to Israel by God. There were articles all over before the Lebanese invasion. This is simply destroying Lebanon and saying to the Israeli people, we're getting rid of Hamas, you can be safe again. So that they can win back brownie points, because Israelis have figured out that they don't want to bring the hostages home. They then invade Lebanon. They then assassinate the leadership, which brings Iran in. And guess what? There was news reports that they already struck within Syria the Russian port. Yemen then starts targeting more UK and US ships within the Middle East, within the Mediterranean Sea, or within the Red Sea, sorry. The Mediterranean Sea is connected to the Syrian port. That creates carnage within Egypt, bankrupts their economy. They end up in a hyperinflationary cycle to the IMF. Then they're a puppet for America. Yemen is now currently being bombed by the UK and the US right now. Massive escalation. They're implementing the equivalent of a sanction when you are resisting against these moves. What does that lead to? That could then ignite the original peace between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Why? Because Yemen retaliates by doing what they previously did. They target oil fields within Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the real controller of the price of oil. That then sends more money back to America that fuels the US military industrial complex from the increase in the price of oil, and that is profitable for the US war machine. Then the Houthis come along, they start bombing those things. We get an oil price strike. What happens there? This starts to impact the US banking system, just like it did before. This then interferes in US politics. The Fed then comes out again and says, we need to reduce rates. We need to bail out the system. The system then gets consolidated into a smaller number of banks. The high oil prices support Iran and Russia in having a stronger defense against, and more of a unification in that creates inflation within China. These high oil prices create inflation. The Fed and the central banks perpetuate it. We have higher inflation in US and China. Why? Who benefits? The consolidation of all the banks that then wipes into a CBDC that is created by the Federal Reserve that leaves America taken over an indebted and rat and communist country. That's what they did to the UK. Resist, people. Peaceful resistance is Bitcoin. And this is why I'm so, look at UK politics. So all of a sudden, when the UK is completely bankrupted and we need to go to war, Boris suddenly quits. This was after, the US government getting their vaccine profits, and Boris gets in the way of all peace negotiations and stops all peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that escalated the war rather than negotiate. Suddenly, Boris is no longer useful, and the media says that we all need to hate Boris Johnson because he went to a party during COVID, during lockdowns. And so suddenly Boris Johnson is painted as the devil, he suddenly needs to go. An unelected official, Rishi Sunak, suddenly is the man that we need to have in place. He profited significantly from the vaccines. Look at Follow the Money. Look at his connections. Suddenly, we're told that Rishi Sunak is not the Prime Minister of America, and he retires for no reason, with no reason, and says we're having a snap election. That snap election happens within 2 weeks. Suddenly, 2 weeks, Keir Starmer is the new leader.
I think you mentioned Rishi Sunak being leader of America.
Thank you, Azad. It's getting to the 2-hour mark. This is when I start saying crazy things. I sound like Keir Starmer, who called the hostages sausages. Appreciate that, Azad. The language, please. So, where were we? Rishi Sunak, the leader of the UK. Suddenly, he's no longer the leader. You know, this is the same time as we're told that Biden's no longer the leader, and we're told that Trump needs to be assassinated 2 times. All happens at the same time. And suddenly, what does Keir Starmer do in the UK? Well, he wins a snap election. He doesn't talk about the cost of living crisis in the UK. He talks about his unequivocal support for Ukraine and Israel, and that we need to send more money and support Ukraine, and we need to support by sending long-range missiles into Russia. We didn't elect him. It was a snap election. We had 2 weeks to do that. Unanimous. Who's controlling the politicians? Who is controlling our prime minister? Is this democracy? Really doesn't look like it for now. Follow the money and you start to realize where this all goes. So once all the leadership is in place, once we're headed towards an election, suddenly now Israel has the best intelligence in the world and can wipe out all of the leadership. If it had the best intelligence in the world, why couldn't it wipe out Hamas and return the hostages? Suddenly, when the timing is right, it's got everything that it needs and it can do precision targets. Suddenly, when it's going after a leader in Iran, it makes no destruction around it. But when it does it in Lebanon and Gaza, it makes all of this crazy destruction all around it. And now 85% of all the infrastructure in Gaza is destroyed. Could it be that that's what the plan was in the first place? And what happens with Iran's new president when suddenly one of them falls down in a helicopter? The new one, why did we get such a long retaliation from Iran? Because America pretended that it was negotiating in peace. And we are told that Nasrallah wanted to de-escalate and that there was going to be a de-escalation process. And so Iran delayed retaliating, even though it had already telegraphed what it was going to do. And then suddenly, rather than negotiating peace, rather than following through the agreement, rather than giving a ceasefire that leads to the return of the hostages, escalation and all of the leadership is blown up and everything goes 10x higher. And the Iranian president has to say, we were tricked. We're now going to do the operation that was delayed while America, UK, and Israel escalate war and then pretend to us that they're trying to de-escalate. And then they kill all of the leadership. Iran trusted America and EU. We get no closer to peace. Not told a word of it. We need to follow the money and need to figure out what's actually going. So Iran came out and said that we thought we had a ceasefire. And then the Turkish president, Erdogan, he comes out and says he basically won't support any cooperation between Israel and NATO. At the same time, follow the money. He led to a lot of the money getting through to Israel that funded ISIS in the first place. And he's still sending through the oil while Israel tries to get energy independent by taking over oil resources. Saudi Arabia, they come out and they announce that there is an international alliance to establish an independent Palestinian state. And so what's happening there? Well, the people in Saudi Arabia are saying, we need to free Palestine, otherwise there will be an uprising. And the kingdom is saying, I need Americans' weapons because I need to maintain my power. And so I want to do deals with Israel, but I can't look like I don't give a damn about the Palestinian cause because that would cause regional craziness in the Middle East. So I'll just do deals with Israel, pretend that I'm servicing. And then if I could just get a Palestinian cause, because Israel won't return the hostages, doesn't care about that, doesn't want to negotiate peace, then maybe we can look like something that won't lead to a revolution within our own country as well. Iran came out and made a statement. It basically said that the United States ordered Israel to kill the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah. US comes out and said, we didn't know anything about it. The Russian foreign minister, he comes out, Lavrov, he comes out and said the United States carried out a terrorist attack in Lebanon with Israel. So, you know, we get both sides of the propaganda, but following the money helps us figure out, we know what the self-interests are as well. And suddenly Kamala Harris, potentially a chosen person that we are told this is the person the Americans are meant to vote for. Kamala Harris says that she supports the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Yemen, then they come out and they say that their rocket, it hit Tel Aviv airport, and that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, this was going to be the same airport that they arrived at. And everybody comes on Spaces and says the Iranian attack did nothing, even though it decimated certain infrastructure. Even though when Lebanon come in, we're being told that there wasn't those 80 casualties by the IDF soldiers. These governments don't give a shit about troops and people. I was on a space the other day where an illegal settler from Israel was celebrating the fact that the French wanted to bring troops. She was celebrating that French troops are going to die for an illegal settlement. That's how extreme everything's got. The Chinese foreign minister, he came out and said that there is a historical injustice suffered by the Palestinian people and that they can no longer be ignored. And there's only one force, the US, that is veto voting and making sure it doesn't happen, because there's a cover-up operation here. The whole world has veto voted to end this blockade in the United Nations. And who are the only ones that don't vote for it? America, Israel, and Ukraine. And so then we get the escalation that Israel wanted. 200 missiles were launched at Israel. And that's what we happened then as well. Prior to that, we have a ground invasion in Lebanon. And we get a few notes. You know that I call this whole thing a proof of weapons network. Well, immediately we get the Gulf state making some announcement, what I call some nodes going down. So nodes are the countries that cover up for protecting this whole operation, this criminal organization called the Israeli government, which is a subsidiary essentially of the Federal Reserve and part of the proof of weapons network. You have all these nodes where the IMF has taken over their country, or they have oil independence, but they need these agreements to support the US war machine. And so we had these announcements from some of the Gulf states who came out and said, we will not allow our air to be used in order to protect Israel anymore. One was Saudi Arabia, the other was Qatar, the other was the UAE, the other was Bahrain, the other was Kuwait. They all declared that they will be neutral in the Iran-Israeli conflict and will not allow US air bases to be used against Iran because they believe it would destabilize and detopple the region, which mean that now it is over to US only. You see where the escalation wants it to go? What does President Biden say? Well, he wakes up from his nap And we're led to believe that he's still the president of US when we know it's Anthony Blinken, the CIA, Mossad, Israel, and the Israeli lobby that owns all of the Congress members, that anyone that resists, suddenly any politician that goes against it, they get eliminated by the ADL and APAC. He started discussing that Israel strikes on Biden comes out and he says, we're discussing with Israel whether striking Iran's oil facilities is an appropriate retaliation. What else did Israel do in this whole thing? Well, suddenly it started targeting the border between Lebanon and Syria. It says it doesn't want any weapons to get through. And so suddenly it launched 7 airstrikes by American-Britain coalition on an airport, and drone strikes that are happening within Yemen and on the border, and now Syria is being brought in as we cover it over. Then we get the little escalation towards the port in Russia, just to basically say, how else can you interpret that? And then the final part is we start to see a fourth front escalating as well. So remember how North Korea was created? It was created when the Bolshevik Revolution was funded to create communism, to detopple Russia, that led to the communism of the Soviet Union. When that ended, we had a Cold War, and America Proof of Weapons Network funded the detoppling of Korea, split it into 2, South Korea, North Korea. The communist ideology, where the central bank benefits from that as well, was implemented into North Korea. And then South Korea became an ally through the South Korean central bank in order to create a proof of weapons network to start surrounding the regions in China with Japan and various other things. So now it starts heating up suddenly between North Korea and South Korea. So Kim Jong-un, he came out and said that he would use nuclear weapons if he is ever attacked by either South Korea or USA, started flexing more of its nuclear defense. And because it has nuclear defense, that sends out a signal to Iran, you don't get attacked when you do have a nuclear defense. What do you think that leads to? That leads to the whole narrative between Iran and Israel of why Iran might escalate its nuclear defenses as well. South Korea came out and started making announcements that it is now pushing for stronger military alliances with Japan and the US. And Japan suddenly gets a new prime minister who is the ex-defense minister that wants to build the NATO of Asia and surround more and more weapons and more American troops around China. As a narrative is perpetuated that China is about to reunify with Taiwan, and you get increased operations that make you believe that we need to go deeper and deeper into World War III. That's all I've got for you. We will keep covering everything that happens each week, and we will cover Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics. Why am I doing that? Because as sad and bad as it gets, I genuinely believe we are in one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history when you are on the right side of the change. And you have a duty to support those on the wrong side of the change and build as much wealth. And I think Bitcoin is the peaceful resistance through this whole thing, because those that don't own Bitcoin over the 4-year cycle, not financial advice, I believe will be on the wrong side of this change. And we need wealthy people to be able to make a difference and resist against this war machine that we are seeing escalate on 3 fronts and take over our indebted governments. And that is it. So always remember, I'd like to see you on the right side of this change. We do it with peace, love, and unity. And I will see you in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 59 next week. Peace.